He was born with his face trapped in silence. No drawing, however beautiful, could show what he felt, until a simple nanny, with trembling hands and serene gaze, sat beside him and in an unexpected gesture drew the missing line. When the millionaire father saw what she did, his world stopped, because at that moment, something money could never buy began to be reborn. The silence in Richard's penthouse was a museum piece, expensive and untouchable. On that grey Manhattan morning, the only sound that dared challenge it was the hesitant scrape of a pencil on paper. Lucas, 7 years old, with a weight in his eyes no child should carry, was trying to give form to a face that memory insisted on fading. His mother's face. His small, fragile fingers gripped the pencil with disproportionate strength, but the right side of his face remained still, a plaster mask betraying the frustration that simmered within. The paralysis, a consequence of a trauma doctors couldn't explain and his father couldn't fix, had stolen more than his smile. It had stolen his ability to mirror the pain he felt. From a distance, leaning against the doorframe of his office, Richard watched. The bespoke suit, tailored to perfection, seemed like armor that barely contained the exhaustion of a man who had built an empire but was watching his own home crumble. He was a master at managing his vast portfolio, at turning investments into more wealth, but he was a complete novice in the art of mending a child's heart. Guilt was a shadow that followed him through the marble hallways, a constant reminder of his absence. The monotony was broken by Elena's arrival. She walked through the doorman-guarded entrance of the high-rise, as if entering an unknown world, bringing with her the scent of rain-soaked city pavement and a worn handbag where she kept her interrupted dreams. Her eyes, large and brown, held a mixture of fear and faith, the duality of someone who needs the money to survive but refuses to let hope die. Richard received her in the foyer, his posture rigid, his voice low and sharp. "My son doesn't need pity. He needs routine and discipline. The salary is generous. The terms are in the contract. Any questions?" Elena just shook her head, intimidated by the oppressive luxury and the coldness of the man before her. He led her to the playroom, a vast and immaculate space where every object seemed positioned for an architectural digest photo shoot, not for the hands of a child. And there was Lucas, frozen before the easel, the drawing of a face with an unfinished smile. Seeing the anguish contained in that small body, something inside Elena broke. She understood that the silence of this home was not one of peace, but of pain. Ignoring etiquette and common sense, she approached slowly, her steps soft on the Persian rug. She didn't say a word. She just knelt beside the boy, the scent of her simple drugstore perfume contrasting with the imported air freshener. Lucas glanced at her sideways, wary, but didn't pull back. With the delicacy that seemed to come from another life, Elena placed her hand over his, feeling the small knots of tension in his fingers. Together, her hand guiding his, they brought the pencil back to the paper. The graphite glided, uncertain, trembling, completing the curve that was missing from the portrait's mouth. One line, a sketch of a smile. It was at that exact moment that Richard, who had returned upstairs for a forgotten briefcase, stopped at the half-open door, his heart suddenly tight. He saw the scene, the simple, powerful gesture that connected those two lonely souls. The pencil scratched the paper, and for a brief second, his son's gaze, previously dull and lost, shone with a light he hadn't seen in months. The most powerful man on Wall Street, a multi-millionaire accustomed to moving the stock market, stood completely still, unable to understand how such a simple touch could achieve what all his fortune could never buy. The days that followed were a silent dance of approach and retreat. Elena arrived punctually, bringing with her the light of a world Richard didn't know, a world where kindness wasn't a business strategy, but a way of being. She didn't try to fill the silence with forced conversations. Instead, she introduced sounds that seemed to heal. In the morning, soft music played from her old smartphone replaced the austere ticking of the grandfather clock. She narrated her actions in a low, sing-song voice, as if telling the boy a secret. "Now, we'll fold this blanket so it's nice and warm, like a hug." At first, Lucas just watched, his eyes following her every move with a curiosity he hadn't shown in a long time. Richard, from his glass-walled office, saw everything. Amidst profit spreadsheets and conference calls about the volatile crypto market, his attention would drift to the woman watering the plants on the terrace while humming a melody from her childhood. He, who controlled a net worth that was the envy of any investor, felt powerless before that disarming simplicity. Elena noticed that the walls of the house were as bare as Lucas's gaze. On one of her first days, she brought colored paper and a pair of safety scissors from home. She sat on the floor next to him and began to cut out simple shapes: a yellow sun, a white cloud, a blue bird. Without asking, she just showed him the roll of tape. After a few minutes of hesitation, his small hand reached out and touched the object. It was a silent victory. Together, they taped the figures onto the immense glass window of the living room, transforming the gray Manhattan skyline into a vibrant, childish scene. Richard came home that night and stopped, stunned at the sight. His first reaction was irritation. This shattered the expensive, minimalist aesthetic the interior designer had spent months creating. But then he saw Lucas's reflection in the glass. The boy looking at the blue bird with an expression that bordered on enchantment. The father swallowed his reprimand. What was the harmony of a room compared to the possibility of harmony in his son's soul? The small transformations accumulated like grains of sand forming a dune. Elena started leaving notes with simple drawings on Lucas's bathroom mirror. A heart, a star, a boat. They were messages that required no response, only presence. The boy began to react, first with guttural sounds, then with murmurs that resembled attempts at words. And then, on a rainy afternoon, while Eleanor was drawing with him at the small table in the living room, Lucas did something extraordinary. He smiled. It wasn't the wide, symmetrical smile of before, but a shy, crooked movement of the left side of his mouth, a spasm of joy that lit up his face for a second. Elena felt her heart overflow and smiled back, tears in her eyes. "That's it, my angel. What a beautiful smile." The father, coming down the stairs to get a glass of water, witnessed the scene. He saw his son's crooked smile and felt the floor drop out from under him. A wave of relief washed over him, so overwhelming it left him breathless. But then another emotion followed, darker and more uncomfortable. Seeing the genuine connection between Elena and Lucas, the gratitude he felt was mixed with a sour, unsettling feeling he took a moment to identify. It was envy. Envy was a slow poison, and Richard felt it course through his veins every time he saw Lucas's crooked smile directed at Elena. He, who dealt in billion-dollar investment funds and understood the complex mathematics of compound interest, didn't know how to manage the small, fragile emotional capital of his own son. He tried to get closer, buying expensive toys, technological gadgets that promised to stimulate cognition, but Lucas looked at them with the same indifference he showed the stock market charts on his father's tablet. The true assets of that house, he was beginning to realize, were not in his vault or his Swiss bank accounts. They were in the simple gestures of a woman who earned in a month what he spent on a single business dinner. That realization humiliated and enraged him in equal measure. Gratitude fought against his wounded pride, and pride almost always won. He convinced himself that he needed to restore order, to make it clear that this was a professional relationship, a contracted service, not an emotional adoption. The thunderstorm that broke over New York that Tuesday night seemed to mirror the chaos that had taken hold of Richard. Thunder rumbled, and the rain lashed against the penthouse windows. Lucas, who had always been afraid of storms, was surprisingly calm. Sitting on the living room rug, he pointed at the figures in a storybook that Eleanor was reading to him in a serene voice that rose above the sound of the storm. She made voices for the characters, a fearful lion and a brave mouse, and Lucas followed, fascinated. At one point, Elena pointed to the figure of a fairy godmother in the book and said, "And she looked after the prince with all the love in the world." Lucas then lifted his gaze from the paper, fixed it directly on Elena's face, raised his trembling little hand, and with a clarity that made the air vibrate, uttered the word that would seal the fate of all three: Auntie. The word came out whole, clear, a pearl of sound in the ocean of silence he inhabited. Elena froze, her heart racing, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Richard heard it. He was in the hallway, on his way to the kitchen, and the word hit him like a punch to the gut. Auntie. Not Mom, but something close, something intimate. A title of affection his son had given to a stranger. In that instant, the poison of envy became bitter and unbearable. He entered the room, his expression dark, ignoring the emotion that hung in the air. His voice came out harsher than he intended. "It's late. Time for bed, Lucas." The next day, he called Elena into his office. He was cold, direct, and cruel. "From now on, I want all activities restricted to the inside of the apartment. No trips to the playground, no outings. He needs structure, not distractions." Elena looked at him, confused and hurt, not understanding the sudden change. "But, Mr. Thompson, the fresh air is good for him. I decide what's good for my son," he cut her off, giving her no chance to argue. The order was a wall, erected to mark his territory, but the effect was the opposite of what he expected. At lunchtime, Lucas refused to eat. Seated at the table, he pushed his plate away, lips sealed, his gaze fixed on an empty point in a silent, devastating protest. Lucas's hunger strike was not an act of defiance, but a declaration of silent war. The dining table, once a space of discomfort, became a battlefield. On one side, Richard, his authority shaken, tried everything. Promises of new toys, veiled threats, even a pleading tone he hated himself for using. On the other, Lucas, a 7-year-old general entrenched in his silence, chin held high in unshakable stubbornness. In the middle, Eleanor felt her heart constrict, an impotent mediator between two worlds that didn't speak the same language. She saw the suffering in both. In the boy, the pain of loss and incomprehension. In the father, the panic of a man accustomed to controlling everything, from the price of gold to the cash flow of his companies, but who was now unable to convince his own son to accept a spoonful of soup. He, who watched his net worth grow by the hour, watched his son's health diminish with every refused meal. The food grew cold on the plate, untouched, a monument to his failure. 2 days passed. The house, already silent, became somber. Lucas's paleness was more evident, and an apathy began to take over his small body. Elena tried to intervene, approaching Richard in the library, where he took refuge behind reports on his investment returns. "Mr. Thompson, with all due respect, he's not going to give in. The ban on the park, it's hurting him. A child needs sunshine. Other children." He barely looked up from the papers, his voice as cold as the marble beneath his feet. "I'm his father, Elena. I know what's best. Stick to your duties." She retreated, but she was not defeated. Her concern was greater than her fear of being fired. She knew she needed her salary, that her siblings depended on that income, but the image of Lucas wasting away was stronger than any financial need. She had no assets or a large inheritance to give her security, only the conviction that love was the only remedy for that sick house. Time passed, and the forced coexistence in that heavy atmosphere brought them inevitably closer. Elena began to notice the details that the pain concealed. She discovered that the top floor of the penthouse, where Richard never let her go, held a secret. The room of his late wife, Laura, remained untouched. a shrine frozen in time. One day, while Richard was in an endless meeting about a new stock acquisition, Elena saw Lucas, in a burst of energy she hadn't seen in days, walk resolutely toward the stairs leading to the forbidden floor. Her heart froze. She followed him silently, torn between her duty to stop him and the curiosity to understand what drew him there. The door was ajar. The boy went in, and she watched him from the crack, her breath held. The room was bathed in a soft light coming through a skylight. Her perfumes were still on the vanity. A silk shawl rested on an armchair, and on the wall, a large, unfinished painting, a landscape portrait, awaited brushstrokes that would never come. Lucas didn't touch anything. He just stopped in front of a small picture frame on the piano and, with trembling fingers, caressed the smiling face of his mother. At that moment, the door flew open with violence. Richard appeared, his face transfigured with fury. "What are you doing in here?" The shout echoed through the silent sanctuary, breaking the spell. Lucas flinched, a sob caught in his throat, and Eleanor, without thinking, stepped in front of the boy like a shield. "It was my fault. I followed him." It was the first time anyone in that house had stood up to him. The silence that followed was deeper and sharper than the shout itself. The silence that settled in Laura's room was dense and heavy, a palpable substance filling the space between them. Richard looked at Elena's hand, resting firmly on his son's shoulder, and the fire of his fury wavered, turning to the ashes of confusion and shame. For the first time in years, someone was confronting him within his own empire, not over a business deal or a piece of his fortune, but over something infinitely more valuable that he didn't know how to negotiate: his son's well-being. Elena met his gaze, chin high, the fear in her eyes overshadowed by a fierce determination that completely disarmed him. He, the man who made billionaires tremble in boardrooms, backed down from the stare of a woman who had nothing to lose but a job that barely paid her bills. Without another word, he turned and left, shutting himself in his office. The sound of the door slamming was the only admission of his defeat. Elena felt her whole body tremble as the adrenaline subsided. She hugged Lucas tightly, feeling his small heart beating erratically against her chest. "It's okay, my angel. It's over," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She took him back to the playroom, their safe haven, and sat on the floor, pulling out a box of colored pencils. Her mind, however, was miles away. She was calculating the liabilities of her actions, losing her job, back to square one. The difficulty of explaining to her siblings that next month's rent money wouldn't be coming. She felt like a fool. What right did she have to challenge the man of the house? But then she looked at Lucas, who was picking up a blue pencil and starting to scribble on a piece of paper, and she knew she would do it all over again. That boy's well-being had become one of her most precious assets, an emotional investment she wasn't willing to liquidate. In his office, surrounded by screens displaying the frenetic dance of dollars, euros, and cryptocurrencies, Richard felt like the poorest man in the world. The image of Elena protecting Lucas wouldn't leave his mind. He had turned Laura's room into a mausoleum, a daily reminder of his grief. And he had been dragging his son into that mourning with him every day. His outburst hadn't been about the invasion of his space, but about the mirror the scene had held up to him, a stranger's courage in defending his son, while he, the father, was drowning him in his own bitterness. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the depth of his failure. All his capital, all his wealth, seemed useless, a pile of colored paper against the complex architecture of the human soul. He had to fix this, not with gifts or trips, but with a gesture of humility, the rarest currency in his vast treasury. Hours later, as the sun set, painting the sky in orange and purple, he found her in the kitchen. Elena was making a sandwich for Lucas, her movements mechanical, her posture tense like someone awaiting a sentence. Richard stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, Unable to find the right words. "Elena," he began, his voice hoarse. "What happened earlier, I shouldn't have yelled." The confession came out with difficulty, as if torn from his chest. "I apologize." Elena stopped cutting the bread and looked at him, surprised. The apology was more than she had expected. He continued, his gaze averted to the window. "I wanted to thank you for taking such good care of him." He paused, gathering courage. "I was wondering if you and Lucas would have dinner with me tonight. Here." The proposal hung in the air, as unexpected as the apology. Elena hesitated, her heart pounding. This was crossing a line, a dangerous border between the professional and the personal. But then she looked at the tired face of this man, a glimpse of vulnerability in his fortress, and she thought of Lucas. For the boy, she would take the risk. In a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "We accept, Mr. Thompson." Dinner was set in the main living area, not the formal, rarely used dining room. Richard instructed the chef to prepare simple but elegant dishes, a clumsy attempt to create an atmosphere that wasn't oppressive. When Elena came down with Lucas, she had changed from her simple uniform into a modest dress that suited her well, and had arranged her hair in a way that softened her face. Richard felt something stir inside him, a strange and long-forgotten sensation. He, who analyzed the value of stocks and companies with surgical precision, felt unable to classify that emotion. They sat at the table, a triangle of loneliness trying to form a line. The clinking of silver cutlery against porcelain was the only sound, an awkward echo of the silence that separated them. Lucas, sensing the tension, barely touched his food. Richard tried to make conversation, asking Elena about her family, about the education degree she dreamed of finishing. He learned that she supported 2 younger siblings since their parents passed away, that she had been working since she was 16, and that she saw education as the only way to build a fortune no one could take from her knowledge. Elena, in turn, spoke with a sincerity that surprised him. She didn't complain about her hardships. Instead, she told little stories about her community, of neighbors helping each other, of block parties, of a wealth not measured in money but in human bonds. Richard listened, fascinated. Her life was a parallel universe to his, where profit was a hug and dividends were a grateful smile. He realized how poor his own existence was, surrounded by luxury but devoid of real connections. At one point, Elena told a funny story about her younger brother trying to teach the neighbor's parrot to sing their favorite team's anthem. The image was so absurd and genuine that something broke inside Richard. A laugh escaped his lips, hesitant at first, then genuine and loud, a laugh he hadn't let out in years. The sound echoed through the room, surprising even himself. Lucas, who had never heard his father laugh like that, looked at him with wide eyes and, infected, let out a small, muffled giggle, the left side of his mouth curving into a smile. In that instant, under the soft light of the candelabras, something shifted. The invisible barrier between them cracked. Elena smiled at the scene, and her eyes met Richard's across the table. It was a brief look, but laden with a meaning neither of them dared to name. A silent attraction, born not of passion, but of shared vulnerability, a reflection of their lonely souls in the crystal of a wineglass. It was dangerous, reckless, and completely inevitable. They finished dinner in a different kind of silence, no longer heavy, but contemplative. Richard offered to put Lucas to bed, a gesture he usually delegated to Elena. When he returned, she was in the living room, gathering the toys that had been left scattered about. "Elena," he said, his voice softer, "thank you for tonight." She just nodded, not knowing what to say. His proximity made her nervous, aware of her own position in that house. She was the nanny, an employee. He was the boss, a multi-millionaire. They were from different worlds, with destinies that, in theory, should never cross. The seed of complication, however, had already been planted. The next day, At the entrance of the elite prep school, where Lucas was a student, the headmistress, a woman with a rigid posture and an inquisitive gaze named Mrs. Albright, watched from a distance as Richard said goodbye to his son. She noted the way he exchanged a quick glance with the nanny, the way Elena adjusted the collar of Lucas's shirt with an intimacy that didn't seem professional to her. Mrs. Albright, guardian of propriety and the institution's impeccable image, felt a prickle of unease. She knew Richard's story, the tragedy of his wife, and she saw in this proximity between employer and employee fertile ground for gossip. What she didn't know was that her unease would soon turn into a weapon, a tool to spread poisonous insinuations that would threaten to destroy the fragile bridge being built in that house of marble and echoes. The danger, now, came not from within, but from a world that did not tolerate the blurring of social lines. Happiness was a fragile shoot trying to break through the frozen soil of that house, and for a brief period, it seemed it would blossom. Richard's mornings no longer began with the weight of the world on his shoulders, but with the distant sound of Lucas's laughter, a sound he now associated with Eleanor's presence. He would watch them from his bedroom window, their little morning routine before school. Elena kneeling to tie Lucas's shoes, fixing his hair with a care that was both motherly and respectful. One of those mornings, at the school gate, Lucas, in a spontaneous and extraordinary gesture, turned and hugged Elena around the waist, a tight, lingering embrace. Richard, watching the scene from inside the car, felt his heart expand. For the first time in a long time, he glimpsed a future that wasn't just a continuation of his painful past, but he wasn't the only one who witnessed the scene. Across the courtyard, Mrs. Albright, the headmistress, observed with her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. To her, this wasn't a gesture of affection, it was the breach of an invisible protocol, a dangerous mixing of classes that tarnished the facade of her elite institution. The poison began to spread in whispers. In the coffee shops where the mothers gathered after drop-off, Richard's name was mentioned with false compassion. Poor man, so vulnerable after the tragedy, one would say. But this nanny, it seems inappropriate, doesn't it? So familiar, another would add. The words, carefully chosen, were like stones thrown from a distance. The pressure on Richard began subtly, first with sideways glances at the school's charity gala, then with comments disguised as advice. Richard, dear, you know how vicious people can be. For Lucas's sake, perhaps it would be best to maintain a certain distance. Your family's image is an asset that needs protecting. He tried to ignore it, furious at the hypocrisy of these people, who measured life in dollar figures and appearances, but didn't have an ounce of the humanity Elena showed in every gesture. He knew she wasn't interested in his fortune. She was interested in his son's happiness. Richard's resistance, however, had its limits, and the business world, in which he was a king, had its own cruel rules. The final blow came in the form of a phone call. It was from one of the most influential members of the school's board, a man whose capital was intertwined with his in several investment funds. The voice was friendly, but the message was clear. Richard, I've heard some rumors. You know how it is in our world. Reputation is everything. An image of family instability could affect investor confidence. Just a friendly word of advice. Of course, it wasn't advice. It was a threat. That call backed him into a corner. On one side, the fragile happiness blooming in his home. On the other, the empire he had built, the structure that guaranteed Lucas's future, the world of power and influence that was the only thing he knew how to master. He felt like a coward, but the cold logic of the businessman won out over the heart of the man who was beginning to feel. To protect the whole, he would have to sacrifice the most important part. That evening, the routine seemed painfully normal. Elena gave Lucas his bath, read him a story, and put him to bed. She came down the stairs humming softly, feeling for the first time a sense of peace, of belonging. The light in Richard's office was on. He called her in, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Elena, please, have a seat." The air in the room was frigid. He wouldn't look her in the eye. His gaze was fixed on his computer screen, where stock charts silently rose and fell. He pushed a white envelope across the polished mahogany desk. His voice came out like a blade. "Precise and cold, your services are no longer required. I believe this is what's best for my son. In this envelope, you will find your severance and a very generous compensation package for your time." The words hit her like stones, knocking the air from her lungs. Compensation package, money. As if that could pay for the bond they had created. She sat frozen, the buzz of silence in her ears, the white envelope looking like a tomb for her hopes. The world she had begun to rebuild collapsed in an instant, without warning, without explanation, leaving only one devastating question hanging in the cold air. Why? Elena did not cry. The tears were trapped in her throat, a ball of pain that kept her from breathing. She looked at the white envelope on the desk, then at Richard's face, a mask of professional coldness that barely concealed the cracks in his eyes. He spoke of money, of a generous compensation, as if affection could be liquidated like a stock on the market. She didn't want his fortune, she wanted to understand, but the question why died on her lips. The answer was clear in that room. She did not belong in this world. Silently, she stood, took the envelope, feeling the weight of the paper, the insult of every bill inside. Without a word, she turned her back and walked out of the office, out of the life that for a brief moment had felt like hers. The journey home was a blur. The crowded subway, the tired faces, the city lights that once seemed like promises were now just a reminder of the distance between her world and his. She clutched the strap of her bag, the envelope burning inside, a certificate of her own insignificance. Richard remained in his office for over an hour after she left. He expected to feel relief, the sense of having solved a complex problem, of having protected his assets from an imminent risk. Instead, what he felt was a colossal void. The house, which had rediscovered sounds and colors, plunged back into its original silence, but now it was a different, accusing silence. He stood and walked through the penthouse. He passed the living room and saw the colorful drawings that Elena and Lucas had taped to the window. The yellow sun, the blue bird. They looked like ghosts of a happiness he himself had exorcised. He had made a business decision, calculated the risks, mitigated the damage to his reputation, but the emotional liability of that transaction was incalculable. He, the billionaire who understood the complex cash flow of multinational corporations, had gone bankrupt, managing the simple economy of a home. Loneliness was once again his only companion, more oppressive and colder than ever. The next morning dawned grey and cold, a mirror of the soul of that house. Richard woke with a stone in his chest. He would have to face Lucas. For the first time, he was afraid of his own son. He gathered what courage he had left and went to the boy's room. He opened the door with a forced smile. "Good morning, champ. Time to get up." Lucas sat up in bed, his eyes still swollen with sleep, and looked around, his entire body a question. He was looking for her scent, for the soft voice that woke him every morning. His gaze met his father's, and the question came, not in words, but in the purity of his confused expression. Richard moved closer, the fake smile crumbling. "Son, Elena, she's not coming anymore." The explanation was a disaster. He used empty words like changes and new phases, the same jargon he used to fire executives. Lucas didn't cry. His face, which had rediscovered the movement of a smile, went back to being a blank canvas. The light in his eyes, that tiny flame Elena had so painstakingly kindled, simply went out. The rest of the morning was an exercise in torture. Lucas refused to eat, to get dressed, to leave his room. He just sat on his bed, staring at the wall. His silence was a weapon, more powerful than any scream. In an act of desperation, Richard remembered the drawing, the one they had started together, his mother's face. The smile Elena had helped them complete. He retrieved it from the playroom and brought it to his son, holding it out like a peace offering. "Look, Lucas, let's finish coloring it. Remember?" Lucas looked at the paper in his hands, that piece of cardstock that had become the symbol of his brief happiness, the proof that joy was possible. His face contorted, not from the paralysis, but from a wave of pain so deep it seemed to tear him apart. And then, with a choked scream, a sound that came from the depths of his soul, he snatched the drawing from his father's hands. With a fury no one would have imagined in that small body, his trembling hands tore the paper in half, destroying his mother's smile. He kept tearing, again and again, until the portrait was nothing but a pile of useless confetti on the expensive rug, each piece a fragment of his broken heart. The days following Elena's dismissal were a slow descent into hell. The house reverted to a mausoleum, but worse than before, because now they all knew what life could have been. Richard, in an act of desperation, hired the most qualified nanny his money could find, a Swiss governess with a flawless resume, who spoke 3 languages and specialized in child development. She was efficient, punctual, and completely useless. Lucas treated her like part of the furniture, an expensive, soulless object. He didn't oppose her, which was even more frightening. He simply didn't see her. He spent his days in his room, sitting on the floor, surrounded by the most expensive toys Europe could produce, but his gaze was always lost, fixed on a point beyond the walls of his gilded cage. The silence returned, but now it was accompanied by an echo, the echo of the laughter that no longer existed. Richard collected the pieces of Lucas's mother's drawing and stored them in a desk drawer, as if they were the fragments of a crime he himself had committed. In his empire of glass and steel on Wall Street, Richard was a king commanding an army of numbers. He closed one of the biggest deals of his career, a merger that would add hundreds of millions of dollars to his already vast net worth. His partners toasted with champagne, celebrating the astronomical profit, the dividends that would multiply. He raised his glass, a mechanical smile on his face, but inside he felt hollow. The market euphoria, the rising stocks, the glitter of gold in the form of charts. It all felt like a farce, a board game for adults, while the real thing, his son's pain, was disintegrating at home. He looked at the flashing screens, at the incessant dance of stock prices, and could only think of Lucas's face, of the light that had gone out in his eyes. What was the point of being a billionaire if he couldn't buy back a single genuine smile from his son? His immense wealth was a joke, a mountain of paper that was burying him instead of lifting him up. Meanwhile, miles away, in a small apartment in an outer borough, Elena was living her own grief. The envelope with the severance pay remained on the living room table, untouched. Her siblings didn't understand. "Elena, this is a fortune. It could pay the bills for a year. Why don't you deposit it?" She couldn't explain that the money felt tainted, cursed. Spending it would be like accepting the price Richard had put on her affection for Lucas. Instead, she got a temporary job at a bakery, waking up at dawn to knead dough, her hands aching, her mind far away. Every night, before sleeping, she would take a small blue paper bird from her apron pocket, one she had made with Lucas that had accidentally come with her on the day she was fired. She would smooth it with her fingers, imagining the boy alone in that huge, cold house, and her heart would break a little more. Her worry for him was a physical pain, more real than hunger or exhaustion. That Friday, exhaustion finally caught up with Richard. He came home to find Lucas in the same state, a little ghost haunting the marble halls. He tried to talk, to show him a new book, but the boy looked at him as if he were a stranger. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned for hours until sleep ambushed him, and then he dreamed, not of Laura, his late wife. He dreamed of the sound of Elena's voice telling a story, of the warmth of her hand on Lucas's, of the smell of banana bread she had made on a rainy afternoon. He woke up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, with a clarity that hit him like lightning. He hadn't fired Elena to protect his image or his business. He had fired her out of fear. Fear of the connection she had with his son. Fear of the feeling that was beginning to grow in his own chest. Fear of feeling anything again. And in that dark, lonely room, he finally understood the scale of his cowardice. He hadn't protected his son. He had sacrificed him. Saturday morning arrived, dragging a white, lifeless sky, a perfect mirror for Richard's soul. The clarity that insomnia had brought him during the night didn't dissipate with the daylight. On the contrary, it became sharper and more painful. He looked in the mirror and didn't see the successful multimillionaire from the covers of business magazines, but a bankrupt man, a father who had put his pride and fear above the happiness of his only son. The decision was made right there in front of his own reflection. He was going to fix what he had broken, no matter the cost. It wouldn't be with money, not with a new investment or a calculated strategy. It would be with the only capital that mattered now: humility. He went into Lucas's room and found him already dressed, the Swiss governess having prepared him like a doll for a shop window. Richard knelt in front of his son, ignoring the other woman's presence. "Champ," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Let's go for a walk, just the two of us." For the first time in weeks, Lucas didn't ignore him. He looked up, a flicker of curiosity in his dull eyes. Richard put him in the jacket Elena had bought for him at a department store, a simple coat that clashed with his designer clothes, but that the boy seemed to love. He dismissed the governess and the driver, an act that was in itself a revolution in his controlled routine. He got behind the wheel of the luxury car himself, his hands, accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, feeling the weight of this simple task, taking his son for an outing. He didn't know where to go. The city, which he usually saw from his penthouse, seemed like an unknown maze at ground level. Then, a memory hit him. The playground, the one he had forbidden, the epicenter of his stupid decision. He drove there, his heart hammering. The playground was almost empty, the sand damp from the previous night's rain. Lucas got out of the car and just stood there, looking at the swing creaking in the wind. The same swing where Eleanor had pushed him so carefully. Meanwhile, in her neighborhood, Eleanor had decided she could no longer live in this anguish. The blue paper bird in her pocket was a summons. She had to know how Lucas was, not to get her job back, not to confront Richard, but out of a pure and simple need of her soul. It was Saturday. She wouldn't be intruding on work hours. With a courage she didn't know she possessed. She took the subway back to that wealthy neighborhood. She wouldn't go to the penthouse, that would be too much. She would go to the school, maybe walk by the nearby park, in the vain hope of seeing him from a distance, just to make sure he was okay. In her hands, inside a plastic bag, she carried something precious. Over the past few days, during her sleepless nights, she had devoted herself to a meticulous task. With glue and infinite patience, she had pieced together the scraps of a drawing she had found in the trash on the day she was fired, Lucas's mother's face, the one he had torn in a fit of pain. She hadn't glued it to hide the cracks. On the contrary, she had filled them with cheap, gold craft dust, turning the scars into veins of gold. And then their paths crossed. Richard was sitting on a park bench, watching Lucas wander aimlessly through the sand, when he saw her. Elena was walking down the sidewalk, head down, the plastic bag in her hands. His heart stopped, then raced. He stood up, but the words wouldn't come. It was Lucas who saw her first. He stopped walking, his small body rigid. His eyes widened, and then a sound came from his mouth, faint, scratched from disuse but unmistakable. "Auntie." The word floated through the cold morning air and hit Elena like a wave. She lifted her head, and her eyes met the boy's. Time seemed to stop. Richard watched the scene from a distance, his chest tight, feeling like an intruder in his own story. Elena ran to Lucas and knelt in front of him, the tears she had held back for weeks finally streaming down her face. "My angel," was all she could manage. Without a word, she took the mended drawing from the bag and showed it to him. "Look," her voice trembled. "Not everything that breaks has to stay ugly. Sometimes the broken parts are what make us stronger." The boy looked at his mother's smiling face, crisscrossed with golden lines, and then at Elena's tearful face. His small hand reached out and, instead of touching the paper, he touched her cheek, a gesture of comfort that mirrored what she had so often done for him. The father, watching from a few feet away, felt something inside him finally begin to mend. Richard took a step forward, then another, each movement feeling like crossing a minefield of his own mistakes. The cold morning air seemed to carry the weight of all the unspoken words between them. Elena looked up from Lucas's face and saw him approaching. In his eyes, there was none of the multi-millionaire's arrogance, none of the employer's coldness, but the raw desolation of a man who had lost everything while surrounded by incalculable fortune. He stopped at a respectful distance, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Elena," his voice came out hoarse, broken. "There is no amount of money in the world, no interest, no dividend that can pay for what I did. I was a coward." The confession hung in the air, brutal in its sincerity. "I didn't fire you because of the school or my image. I fired you out of fear. Fear of seeing my son happy with someone else. Fear of what I was starting to feel myself." He looked at Lucas, who was now clinging to Elena's hand as if it were an anchor. "I can calculate the ROI on complex derivatives. I understand crypto and the gold market, but I failed to understand the value of what we had at home. I tried to settle an emotional liability with a financial asset, and it was the stupidest thing I've ever done. Please, forgive me." Elena listened to every word, feeling the wall of her resentment begin to crumble. The anger she had felt dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming compassion. She saw not the powerful man who controlled a vast fortune, but a broken father, as lost as his own son. She didn't need his wealth or his apology for herself, but Lucas did, for the sake of this boy, who was looking from his father to her, trying to decipher the language of adults. She knew what to do. "We need to go home," she said, her voice soft but firm. "All three of us." The word "we" sounded strange, and yet right. Richard nodded, a relief so profound flooding his face that he seemed to age and grow younger all at once. The ride back was silent, but it was a silence charged with possibility. Lucas sat in the back, holding the mended drawing in his lap, his gaze shifting between the back of his father's neck and Elena's profile beside him. He didn't understand everything, but he felt the change. The air inside the car was no longer thin, it was breathable. When they arrived at the penthouse, the Swiss governess met them at the door, her expression confused at the sight of Elena. Richard was direct, but not cold. He dismissed her with a generosity that closed that chapter of his life, thanking her for her efforts but making it clear that the situation had changed. Alone, the three of them, the house felt both immense and intimate. Richard led them to the living room, where the morning light now streamed in unapologetically. He knelt on the floor, at eye level with Lucas and Elena, who remained kneeling beside the boy. He took the drawing from his son's lap and studied it, his fingers tracing the golden lines that joined the torn pieces. "You fixed him," he whispered to Elena, his eyes full of a gratitude no words could express. "You fix everything you touch." In that moment, the outside world, with its stock market, its business deals, and its social pressures, ceased to exist. They were just three people, three broken hearts trying to find a way to beat in the same rhythm. Lucas looked at the drawing, then at Elena, and then, slowly, turned his face to the man kneeling before him. Their eyes met. For the first time, there was no fear, no distance, only recognition. With an effort that seemed to move mountains inside his small body, the boy's lips moved, and the sound his father had been waiting to hear since his wife's death finally came. Faint but whole, cutting through the silence of the room. Dad. Time stopped. The word, a single syllable, demolished Richard's last defenses. Hot tears streamed down his face without him noticing. Eleanor tried to pull away, feeling that this moment was sacred and belonged only to them, but in a desperate, instinctive gesture, Richard's hand shot out and grasped hers tightly, like a drowning man clinging to the only solid thing in a storm. Richard's hand, holding hers, was warm and firm, an unexpected bridge across the chasm that had separated them. Elena felt a shock run through her, an electric current of pure emotion. He didn't let go. Instead, he squeezed her fingers tighter, as if afraid she might disappear. Kneeling on the floor of that light-flooded room, the three of them formed an island. The word "Dad," still echoing in the air, had changed everything. It had dissolved years of grief and months of silence. Lucas, seeing his father's hand over Elena's, reached out his other small hand and placed it on top of both of theirs, joining them. It was an instinctive gesture, the seal of a child who, in his wisdom, understood that these two pieces of his heart needed to be together for him to feel whole himself. In that instant, the barriers of class, money and pride turned to dust. They were just two people sharing the responsibility and the miracle of healing a third. Richard lifted his gaze to Elena, tears still shimmering in his eyes, and what he saw took her breath away. There was no trace left of the calculating billionaire. There was only a man, vulnerable and infinitely grateful. The following months were a delicate reconstruction, like piecing together a valuable porcelain vase. Eleanor returned, not as a nanny, but as something they had yet to name. She wouldn't accept a salary, but Richard insisted on fully funding her return to college to finish her education degree, depositing the tuition directly into the university's account, a gesture she accepted as a pact of mutual respect. The house began to change. The scent of wax and cleaning products was gradually replaced by the smell of carrot cake and fresh paint. The routine was no longer governed by rigid schedules, but by the rhythm of Lucas's discoveries. The boy's speech blossomed daily, still with some difficulty, but full of new words. He and Elena spent hours drawing, painting, creating entire worlds on sheets of paper. Richard, for his part, started leaving the office earlier. He came home in time to join the mess, to get his hands dirty with paint, to listen to the stories Lucas now made up. He was learning a new language, one that didn't involve stock quotes or the price of the euro, but the priceless value of a hug. Richard's greatest transformation, however, went beyond the walls of his penthouse. Inspired by how art had healed his son, he felt a visceral need to share it. He, who once only thought of investments that generated profit, now wanted to build a different kind of portfolio. Using his power and influence, he proposed a bold project to Lucas's school, the creation of an inclusive art center, a space where children from all social backgrounds, with or without disabilities, could express themselves freely. The headmistress, Mrs. Albright, who had pressured him to fire Elena, was forced to accept the generous donation from the school community's most influential man. She didn't understand his motivation, but she couldn't refuse the capital he offered. The project became Richard's passion. He was involved in every detail, from choosing materials to hiring art therapists, working side by side with Elena, whose ideas and sensitivity were the soul of the project. The culmination of all this effort was the center's inaugural exhibition. The event drew the city's elite, entrepreneurs, investors, all curious to see the tycoon's new venture. The main hall was packed, The walls covered with colorful drawings and shapeless sculptures, an explosion of childhood creativity. The centerpiece of the exhibition, however, stood on a solitary easel, illuminated by a spotlight. It was Lucas's mended drawing, his mother's face smiling through golden scars. Beside the frame, a small plaque read, "What is broken can become even more beautiful." That night, Elena arrived discreetly, blending into the crowd, her heart tight with pride and nervousness. Richard, on stage, was giving a speech about the power of art, but his eyes were scanning the audience, searching for her. When he finally found her, leaning against a pillar at the back of the room, he stopped speaking for a moment. A hush fell. Without needing words, their eyes met and said everything that had been held back for so long. He stepped down from the stage, walked through the crowd that parted for him, and, in front of everyone, held out his hand to her. It was the moment of greatest tension, the resolution of everything. Their world was watching. Time stretched, becoming a dense, elastic substance. Each second weighed a ton. Richard's hand, suspended in the air between them, was not an invitation. It was a verdict. Elena felt hundreds of eyes on her, needles of curiosity and judgment piercing her skin. Her instincts, forged in a lifetime of social invisibility, screamed at her to retreat, to hide in the shadow of the pillar and disappear as she always had. But then she looked at his face, a face she had learned to read, and she saw not the certainty of a powerful man, but the plea of a soul taking one last risk. And she thought of Lucas. She thought of the mended drawing, of the golden lines that celebrated its fractures. In that moment, she understood that her own healing also depended on crossing that room. Slowly, as if emerging from a long slumber, she raised her hand and placed it in his. His skin was warm, and his grip was immediate, firm, a silent promise. The silence in the room was absolute as Richard led her through the crowd. The sea of faces parted for them, a corridor of astonishment and hushed whispers. A camera flash went off, immortalizing the moment. Eleanor held her chin high, her eyes fixed on Richard, refusing to falter. She saw Mrs. Albright near the stage, her mouth agape, her face a mask of disbelief and defeat. The woman who represented the world that had rejected her was now forced to witness her triumphant return, not as an employee, but as the centerpiece of this new story. As they reached the stage, Lucas, who had been watching everything with shining eyes, ran to them. He didn't hug one and then the other. He squeezed in between them and, with a gesture that sealed the fate of the night, took Richard's free hand with one of his and Elena's free hand with the other. There, under the lights, the three of them stood hand in hand, an unbreakable chain. Richard turned to the microphone, but he didn't let go of her hand. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and resonated with an emotion no one there had ever heard. "For many years," he began, "I believed that success was measured in assets. In the growth of my net worth, I became an expert in investments, in turning money into more money, but I was bankrupt of the only wealth that truly matters." He looked at Lucas and then at Elena. "Today, I understand that my greatest investment isn't on the stock market or in treasury bonds. My greatest investment is the time I spend with my son, and my most valuable net worth is the love and healing that this woman," he lifted her hand slightly, "taught us how to draw, even with the pieces that time left behind. She taught us that true value is priceless." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the astonished audience. "This art center isn't about charity. It's about paying the debt I owe to hope. It's about understanding that the most precious things in life don't generate profit." For an instant, there was only silence. Then one person, then another, and suddenly the entire hall erupted in thunderous, genuine applause. It wasn't an ovation for the billionaire, but for the man, for the father, for the courage of this unlikely family. Before everyone's eyes, the rigid, cold Richard smiled, a wide smile unafraid of what anyone would think. The audience applauded the scene. The boy on stage, holding both their hands, his face lit with serene happiness. The headmistress, once haughty, just watched, swallowing her defeat. The silent war was over, and love had won. The main conflicts were resolved, the wounds exposed and healing, ready for the final chapter of this journey of reconstruction. A year later, the morning sun no longer asked permission to enter the penthouse. It was an honored guest. The silence, that expensive, untouchable museum piece, had been auctioned off and replaced by a melody of life. The sound that now broke the quiet was a small giggle, followed by the smell of freshly baked cinnamon rolls from the kitchen. Lucas, now 8, and with a liveliness that seemed to fill every inch of the house, ran through the living room with a paper airplane, making it dive and soar. The right side of his face still held a slight asymmetry when he smiled, a subtle reminder of the journey they had taken, but his smile was so wide and genuine that the imperfection became a charm, a signature of his resilience. The house, once a sanctuary of marble and echoes, now had its kitchen walls covered in colorful drawings, its windows smudged with paint-covered fingerprints, and its once immaculate Persian rugs occasionally served as a landing strip for paper airplanes. Richard came home from the office earlier, a change that had shocked the business world but had seemed the most logical decision to him. He was still a powerful man, a billionaire whose name moved markets. But the definition of wealth in his personal dictionary had been rewritten. On his mahogany desk, next to the terminal displaying treasury bond rates and currency prices, now sat a picture frame with a photo of the three of them on the day of the Art Center's inauguration, and on the main wall, where a complex chart of his fund's returns once hung, was now the framed, mended drawing of Laura's face, the golden lines shining in the light. This was his new stock chart, a daily reminder that the greatest inheritance he could leave his son was not made of money or assets, but of memories and rebuilt love. Eleanor, meanwhile, divided her time between college and her life with them, bringing home the enthusiasm of her studies and the wisdom of her gentle soul, becoming the pillar that balanced Richard's reason and Lucas's imagination. On that Saturday afternoon, the three of them were sitting on the living room floor. A large sheet of craft paper spread over the rug. Richard awkwardly was trying to draw a castle, his straight, precise lines of a financial engineer contrasting with the free, dreamlike shapes of Lucas, who was drawing a seven-headed dragon. Elena laughed, coloring the sky an impossible shade of orange. "Dad, the dragon won't be able to get into your castle. The door is too small," Lucas said, with the irrefutable logic of a child. Richard looked at his drawing, then at his son's costumes and smiled. "You're right, champ, so let's tear down the walls." And with a theatrical gesture, he scribbled over the walls of his perfect castle, making room for his son's colorful dragon. In that simple act lay the essence of his transformation, the willingness to tear down his own fortresses, to let life in. They were not a perfect family from a fairy tale. They were a real family, made of glued-together pieces, of different pasts and a future they were learning to draw together, day by day. The simple Nanny remained simple. The reserved man remained reserved. But the silence that once separated them was now a space of comfort, filled with an understanding that needed no words. The love that bound them had not fixed the cracks in their lives. It had filled them with gold, making them stronger and infinitely more beautiful. The drawing on the office wall was not just a symbol of their story, it was an instruction manual. It showed that crooked lines, fractures and scars are not the end. With the right hand to hold yours, they can become the beginning of everything, one line at a time, until the heart finally finds its way back home.